Hello there, I'm Aiden, and welcome to A Pastor's Life for Me. Now, I know what you're thinking. It has been a while since I've posted a video, over a month. I've been busy. I think that goes without saying. I'm sorry about it, and it's not even that I didn't even film videos. You know, I had done some filming, but I wasn't happy with the video itself, so I didn't post it. And I have some stuff from before, but I haven't written a script alongside it. There's just been a lot going on in my life, especially, you know, being here new at the church and everything that entails getting integrated into all of that. So forgive me, hopefully we'll get back on somewhat of a more normal schedule of releasing a video every week. But today I wanted to do a review of something that keeps popping up in my newsfeed. I don't know about you if you've seen these, you know, Bible at a glance things pop up, or overview of each book of the Bible, or Bible blueprints, and you know, all of these different, here's what each book of the Bible is about. And I've seen many of them popping up over the past month. I thought, let's review one of them, at a glance, books of the Bible. And then next week, hopefully I'll review another one called Bible Blueprints. And this is, I guess, a precursor to something that I have been wanting to do for a while, and that is do my own brief overview of each book of the Bible. And so that is one of the directions that we're going to be heading in the future. So what do I think about these whole Bible at a glance, this series in particular? I think it's actually pretty good. You know, there's a lot of good things about it, and then there's some not so good things, most of them being, I guess you could say, my personal preferences, more than inaccuracies in it. For the most part, overall, it is pretty accurate in what it says. Some things that I very much appreciate about it is, for one, its position on creation. And when I say that, I mean what's commonly known as young Earth. On the book of Genesis, they say that this book covers the time period of 4004 BC to 1805 BC. And by stating that instead of the book covering a time period of millions or billions of years prior, you know, before creation, by stating 4004 BC, it's taking that young Earth stance. Another thing that I very much appreciate about this one is it takes a premillennial stance of the Bible. If you're wondering what that means, I did a whole definition video on that, but essentially premillennial means that you believe that the tribulation talked about in Revelation takes place before the 1,000 years talked about in Revelation chapter 20. Because they take that stance, they date Revelation in a certain way and talk about the time period of Revelation in a certain way and certain prophecies being connected to that time period of the tribulation, the end of days, etc. Something else that I appreciated about this is it seems, well, to me at least, that it takes a complementarian view of the Bible instead of an egalitarian view. If you have no idea what I meant by that, I would suggest that you just go and look up the definitions or some videos on that, because that would be a very lengthy explanation for right now. The fourth thing that I appreciated was the stance that it gives on the authors of the books. More specifically, many of the ones in the New Testament. I've said this before, but in every single one of Paul's letters, some people debate whether or not Paul actually wrote the letter. And what you could end up with is, if you took all of these, well, Paul didn't write this letter, then Paul didn't write anything in the New Testament. And I appreciate when the book states who is the author, they say it is that person who wrote that book. The fifth thing that I very much appreciated about this Bible at a glance was when they say the books of the Bible were written. Just like who wrote the books, the dates that they are written are often highly debated among some scholars. And when you get down to the reason for this, it really has to do with trying to minimize prophecy, or trying to fit in a evolutionary progress of man, as in man is getting smarter along time, into the Bible. As a result, people will say that, you know, certain books of the Bible were written hundreds and hundreds of years later, even after some of the historical events prophesied about, like Isaiah, they'll say happened much later than they were actually probably written. The at a glance here takes the traditional stance of when these books were written and is not bending to some scholars' opinions on that. And I very much appreciate that. And I guess some of these last things that I've been saying summarize why I really like this book. They are giving a very broad overview of each book of the Bible, but they are taking those traditional stances on the book and not being swayed by things that come up at different times in history. That's something that we see happen so often in our time and in our churches today. So I would recommend that you get these and use them as a good tool because, you know, they are a good reference to when you're starting a book. You can take a quick look at it and see who it was written by, when it was written, and some stuff like that. Now, going into some of the negatives of this book, I would say one of the biggest ones that I have is it is very, very, very broad. Even to the point that I would say it's not even really an overview of the book. We're going to be talking about Bible blueprints next week, which sort of gives you a summarization of different sections in the passage, and that fits the term of an overview of a book much better than this. This, as an overview, tells you some of the famous stories or famous parts of the book, as well as a couple of the famous verses, and discusses a few important points in the book. But this is very, very broad, and after reading each page that talks about a book of the Bible, you wouldn't really go away understanding what that book is about. And that's due to it just lacking even some of the very broad overview points of each book. And that's just the style of this one. That's why I think it's important to use a number of these different overviews along with each other so you can get a good solid overview. Something else that I don't really like about this is how they decided to use the range of what the book covers, and specifically I'm referring to prophecy. You get into some of the prophetic books and they'll talk about how the range of that book, they'll start at when the prophet started prophesying, and they'll say to the end of time, or even to now we see it being fulfilled. I sort of understand why they did that, but the problem in doing that is their date ranges within the prophetic books aren't really consistent. And that leads me into my next thing that I dislike about it. There seems to be a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge on the prophets themselves. One thing in particular that is quite often said about the prophetic books is that under their section of famous stories included, they put, no stories are included in this prophetic book. And they do this in a number of books. Two that I'm thinking of in particular is the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah. Now, even just reading through these, one would notice that there is a good section of narrative in these stories. The book of Isaiah has stories about how God sent the prophet Isaiah to King Ahaz to give him prophecies. And that is written in a narrative and then moves into prophecies. You also see that there is narrative about the fall of Assyria when God struck 185,000 Assyrians outside the walls of Jerusalem in 701 BC. These are stories and they are found in the book. In Jeremiah, a common theme in this book is God telling Jeremiah to go do something, to use that as a practical example of what God is going to do to Judah or how they are acting towards God. The ways that these are written are actually stories. And so to say that many of these prophetic books do not contain any stories is actually wrong. And that's only one way that I see this book having that misunderstanding or that lack of knowledge about the prophets. And I would even go as far as to say that their page on Isaiah is just bad. And I think that's due to it being a rather lengthy book. There is a great misunderstanding or lack of knowledge of this book for whoever wrote the page on it. There is that misunderstanding of what Isaiah is actually prophesying about and when these things will take place. In fact, they make the statement, unlike some other prophets, Isaiah does not prophesy about our times or the end times. And this is just plain wrong. Many of Isaiah's prophecies are talking both at the time of Jesus' first coming and the time of Jesus' second coming. That's something that we'll get into when we do our own overview of the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah isn't the only prophet that I have issues with some of their explanations and how they take the prophecy. And remember that they are writing this book with a premillennial view. And so when I say that I have disagreements with certain things that they say, it's not because they have a different view than mine. It's because I think they actually have a misunderstanding of what the prophets are saying in relation to that view, if that makes sense. Another book that on on one hand, I very much appreciated how they handled it, but also very much didn't appreciate how they handled it, is Leviticus. I like how they make the point that we as Christians and even we as Gentiles are not under the laws spoken about in Leviticus. This is a major point in the New Testament. We, as Christians, are not under the law. And they make that abundantly clear in the overview of this book. And that's very important, and I love it. The point, though, that I somewhat like and also don't like at the same time is their explanation of the laws. And in my notes to summarize that, I basically just said that for Leviticus, they have too narrow of an explanation of Levitical laws. And one of the last things that I would say is questionable about this is what they choose for the famous Bible verses of that book. Just some of their choices are questionable, as in, is this actually the most famous verse in the book? I think the best example of this would be the verses they choose in Song of Solomon. There are 2 phrases in this book that are repeated 3 times. And the author's point behind repeating these 3 times is to say, this is what this is all about. This is the point. And neither of those verses are in the most popular verses. Those would be, I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine, and don't awaken love before it's time. So I think that's all that I will say on this review of this overview for now, and we'll go more into it when we actually start doing our own overview of the books of the Bible. But I would like to point out that the points that I disagree with, most of them aren't really inaccuracies in this that make a huge difference. Some of them are, but overall, books of the Bible at a glance is very good. And so I would recommend you get it, but as I said, I would also recommend that you get some of the other ones so that through a collection of these, you have a better idea of what the overview of each actual book is. So next week, we'll talk about another one of these and review it, and it's a very different style than this. In some ways, I think parts of it are much better. That's all for now, so subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and until next time, remember to know the word, do the word, and share the word, but as always, we do it in love.